Do you ever get self-conscious about your voice acting? Maybe you have a specific voice that feels kind of cringy. Or maybe you can't help but compare yourself to professional streamers like Matt Mercer. Me too. But today we're going to discuss why you and I should voice our characters and NPCs anyway.
Hey friends, my name's Timothy, though some people do call me Timberly. I'm a professional dungeon master, and here on my channel, I help you improve your game of Dungeons & Dragons. Let's get to it!
If you think voice acting at your table is intimidating, don't worry, you're not alone. In a little while, I'll share some horror stories of my own, but for now, let's talk about why voice acting can be so intimidating. When I was a kid, I used to hide my head inside of a pillow whenever I was watching television and somebody made a complete idiot of themselves. Looking back, I realized that Data from Star Trek was probably being paid a fairly pretty penny to be on the screen there, and maybe I shouldn't worry so much about appearances. But at the time, I just felt that it was awful that he looked so silly on the screen. And that's something that is a fear that I think lies in all of us. When we put ourselves out there in a way that is not what we're accustomed to, we have that fear that we might look silly in front of our friends. It is a real fear, but it's not necessarily a logical fear. Likewise, we spend a lot of time telling ourselves, oh, I shouldn't do this thing because I'm not good at it. As if by somehow not doing the thing, we will one day become good at it to where we can begin it. Or as if the people who are masters of the craft didn't do a bad job at any time in their careers. Failures are only iterations towards success. We need to persevere and realize that we're not going to feel good enough when we start, and that's okay. Perhaps you're like me and you find it hard to practice voice acting. I have a lot of people in my household, 14 to be exact, and finding a time when I am actually alone is almost impossible, which means if I'm going to practice a ridiculous goblin voice or a new take on the gnome, I am going to have an audience somewhere around. That should, I would think, help me to break through the barrier of using it at the table, but it can still be a real challenge even with a voice that I've practiced. I get flustered, I get worried, I get intimidated by my players' watching eyes, and I fall back on the same old voices that I've already used instead of being willing to stretch because I don't practice enough, because I'm worried about somebody watching, because it feels hard, and because I'm worried that I'm not good enough. That intimidation is a very real feeling, but it's not one that stems from our logical brains, just from our fear of failure and standing out. We need to overcome that in order to move forward and improving our games. But that intimidation can be lessened as we continue to practice and as we recognize the advantages to voice acting that can really help us in the long term. Considering the horror stories I'm about to share with you, I assume that you realize that there are tangible benefits that we'll go over in just a little bit as to why this will improve our games. Otherwise, I wouldn't keep putting myself through it. For probably understandable reasons, when I was a kid, the public school system in Australia taught French or Indonesian as appropriate languages. I decided to take French and took around 4 years of it throughout my high school experience, if only because my French teacher was the only one who would let me sleep in class as long as I could still answer the questions. However, the French accent has long become a plague on my voice acting brain, as I strive to bring out a perhaps more Germanic accent for Curse of Strahd and the village of Barovia, and end up slipping right back into my terrible French instead of my terrible German. Considering that I have a player in that game who is using a French accent and speaks German, it can grow confusing fast. There are often times in our games when we reintroduce an NPC that hasn't been on screen in many moons, and I will confess that probably 9 times out of 10, I am taking a wild, stab-in-the-dark guess as to what the accent should be for that character. Fortunately for me, my players also haven't encountered that NPC in a particularly long time, so unless the accent is the defining point that stuck out in their mind, they don't call me on it too often. A particularly painful moment for me when it comes to voice acting that probably isn't something that any of my players ever realized happened. I spent days practicing and perfecting a new voice while I was driving to and fro. I obsessed over this voice and was convinced that I was going to be able to bring it out of the game. As soon as I got in front of my players, however, I lost my nerve and defaulted back to the standard voices that I've used for years. Despite all that, I continue to strive to use voices in my games, to develop new voices, and to improve upon the voices that I've got. And that's because there's some benefits. The benefits of voice acting are sometimes hard to spot amidst the discomfort of trying out a new voice. We're going to unpack a few of those benefits first before we talk about some tips to make it easier. There's a fancy term that I was recently introduced to. It's called code switching. It's not something that I had ever heard of before, but it was something that I sort of understood in my brain in this very specific way related to voice acting. For me, I personally am an Australian living in America, and as you could probably tell, the accent does as it pleases for the most part and has largely washed away over the last couple of decades. That said, the moment my mum's name shows up on caller ID, my accent is roaring back in to say hello. But the interesting thing that I learned from being essentially bilingual English was that languages, and indeed accents, store in different parts of your brain. The way that I know this is because when my Australian accent is on, there's idioms and sayings and colloquialisms that I just don't use in everyday life that come naturally to my mind from the 18 years I spent in Australia as a child. Meanwhile, when my American accent is in place, I would never think of using those, they just wouldn't come to my brain. They're stored in separate parts of my memory, and the accent actually unlocks that portion of my brain and brings these sayings and the like out into the forefront. I remember telling my wife some saying or another. I can't remember exactly which one it was. I think I told her to come off the grass, and she had to ask me what that meant. And following asking me what that meant was like, where did that even come from? And I told her, what are you talking about? I use that kind of saying all the time. And she's like, no, we've been married 15 years. You've never said that. Suffice to say, I was a little surprised to realize that I hadn't been using that all this time. When we use voices in our Dungeons & Dragons, we get much the same benefit. By compartmentalizing these small snippets of characterization, we build up a repertoire of additional information, thoughts, and processes that are going to come into what we do at the table without us even actually thinking about it. A second benefit that comes from voice acting at the table is narrative identification. When we use consistently the same voices for the same, for instance, races, which is my personal approach, when we switch into that voice for a overheard dialogue or the like, our characters instantaneously know who is doing the speaking. There's plenty of times that I might tell a player that their character hears somebody whispering around the corner saying something like, oh yeah, this is a real nice one. I think this one could go real great on the shelf, and we could use this one. I like it. Yeah, what do you think? Did you find anything interesting? And they'll immediately say, oh, it's goblins. Another benefit to voice acting is how it differentiates between your standard narration and the dialogue of your characters. By utilizing separate voices for the characters or NPCs that you are in control of, you allow people to know more readily and without having to tell them whether or not you are speaking or your NPC or character is speaking. All right, that's all well and good, but let's get stuck into 4 tips that'll help you either improve your voice acting or lower the bar so that we can get started or stay started. First, lean into your instincts when you're voice acting. Like I mentioned about the code switching earlier, when you lean into the voice that you're utilizing, you're going to find that there's going to be sayings, thoughts, actions that come to you without you consciously thinking about them if you let them. Voice acting is in and of itself an improvisational prompt that allows you to start thinking in your character's lens. By switching into that accent and leaning into the instincts that come along with it, you allow yourself to broaden the variety of what you might consider possible, and you narrow down the focus of your character through that lens to become more in tune. Second, don't be afraid to use body language and facial expressions as part of your voice acting. If you ever watch a professional voice actor tucked away in a booth as they're performing, their gesticulations are wild and crazy, their facial expressions over the top. They do that so that their voice can bring out all of those intonations and differences that are otherwise missing, and we can use that that to our advantage as well. For instance, when I get into my goblin voice, I'm particularly hunched. My mouth goes into a sneer. When I'm thinking in my elven voice, my back raises straighter, my head comes up a little. When I'm trying to speak as a female, I'm leaning forward and utilizing more of my head voice. By leaning into those physical differences between the characters and by embodying that NPC just a little in your mannerisms and your physicality, you'll find that your voice improves and your instincts on how to act become even stronger. Third, utilize consistency to your advantage. You don't have to come up with a million different voices and have this perfect bevy, these slight nuances between every character. If you're capable of that, go for it. If you're like me, having a voice for goblins, a voice for dwarves, a voice for halflings, a voice for elves is going to be a great start that will get you along the way, and then small tweaks to your body language or your facial expression or your intonation can make all the difference to nuance those out into various points. But by utilizing consistency to your advantage and sticking to a specific voice for a specific kind of person, you allow people to make those inferences as to who you are, and those voices will start to inform them as to who they're speaking to without you having to go into the great big long descriptives that half of your players are probably tuning out anyway. Finally, let yourself off the hook a little bit when it comes to voice acting and realize that you don't have to voice act in character all the time, every time, for every situation. There are plenty of times when some third-person narration saying what your character does or what this NPC does is the better choice in order to convey the information more succinctly, swiftly, or accurately. If you're having a conversation between two different NPCs in front of your party, you don't have to try and go crazy switching from voice to voice to voice to voice to voice to voice. You can just tell them what they're talking about and allow them to fill in the mental voices, especially if you've already established a voice for each of the speakers. Let yourself off the hook. Realize that although you're trying to be consistent in the voice for a character, not always should you be talking in the first person. Finally, to help you feel better about your voice acting, here's a playlist of my bad voice acting for you to compare yourself to. Oh, buddy, that was not helpful.